Namaskaram, me Andariki Swagatam. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 8th edition of the Neve Literature Festival, a celebration of the love for books, stories, and imagination.
That's right, Ishan. We have authors from India and all around the world coming together to share their incredible journey with words. Today is all about learning, inspiration, and of course, fun.
And for this session, we're kicking things off at Kahani Manch. Whether you're a parent, an educator, or simply a book lover, you're in the right place. So get comfy because it's going to be an amazing day filled with stories and thought-provoking conversations.
But wait, Ishan. There's something special about today, isn't there? I mean, when was the last time we heard stories from historians, children's book authors, and biographers all in one day?
Exactly, Arush. The sessions we're about to introduce explore everything from the magic of childhood reading to the power of stories in shaping identities. So let's dive right in.
First up, we have a session called A Books Filled Childhood and Adulthood. It's all about how books shape us when we're little to when we're, well, not so little.
We have two incredible authors with us, Manu Pillai and Devika Cariapa. They're here to discuss how their childhood love for reading shaped their lives and careers.
Devika Childhood is a Delhi-based author passionate about archaeology and travel. Her book, India Through Archaeology, Excavating History, invites children to discover stories from Indian history through archaeology. It has won the Hindu Young World Good Books Award 2018 and the Sahitya Akademi's Bal Sahitya Puraskar 2019.
Manu Pillai is an acclaimed Indian author and historian known for his engaging works on history, including The Ivory Throne and The Courtesan, The Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin. He's a sought-after speaker and writes to make history accessible and captivating for all. He has received several awards such as the Sahitya Akademi Bal Sahitya Puraskar.
You know, Ishan, it makes you think. We all grew up surrounded by books, but have you ever wondered how stories influence what we do now?
Absolutely. Whether it's fiction, history, or just flipping through pages under a tree, books stick with us. They have a staying power that social media can never quite match. So if you've ever wondered how reading transforms over time, this session is for you.
Well, are you guys ready to dive into this fascinating conversation? Let's welcome Manu Pillai and Devika Childhood.
Thank you so much for that rather scintillating introduction. Historians are not used to being like hyped. But it's a real pleasure to be with you on the stage, Manu. Not just because I deeply respect the work that you do, but also because it's great fun having a conversation about a reading journey. While I was thinking of this, it just occurred to me, humans have created a world which they navigate through words. There are always words to be heard, words to be understood, words to be spoken, and more than anything, words to be written. And when they're written in books, somehow something magical happens. I think Carl Sagan said that, books assure you that humans are capable of creating magic. And Kafka said, books are the axe to our frozen souls. So writing a book and then the reading of that book is a very special journey for most people. So I want to really deep dive into your journey into reading. Let's go back right into your childhood, back, and tell us where it began and whether it shaped the person that you are.
Well, I was born in 1990, so this was still before the switch flipped and everything became about the internet and fast-paced social media and things like that. It was still a time of banyan trees and bungalows in Pune, which is where I grew up. And because it was a slow world, I think in some ways that means that you're less distracted by, there aren't too many options, right? So books were, I think, very much a presence in the background. My father used to read, my grandfather used to read, my sister used to read a great deal. But I don't think I was cut out to read from the start. I was actually a fairly hyperactive, somewhat destructive child, trying more to sort of, out of curiosity, do things than pick up a book and sit down and read. which included trying to jump out of the balcony. I once nearly set my house on fire, because I like to play around with fire and things like that. So, I mean, even the mic system is objecting to my
On
childhood
fire.
of games. So that was the world I used to occupy until at some point I think my older sister, out of sheer frustration, thrust a book in my hands and said, sit still and read this. I don't remember what it was. I think it was probably a comic book of some kind. I think it was just something with lots of pictures. I must have been about 8 or 9. I don't think I was even much younger than that. I was relatively, in 4th or 5th standard when I seriously started reading. And then it took a life of its own. I think by my teens, I even fancied myself a writer. I remember reading a book about witches and wizards and coolly plagiarizing it and writing my own book, for which the only readers were my father and my sister. And then with due family loyalty, they said, great, you have great talent at writing, well done. And then, that was that. So that was my first offering to the literary world. But yes, I think books happened because it was thrust into my hands. And then once I discovered the magic of it, it was easy enough to, be seduced and continue on that journey. By my mid to late teens, I was reading a lot of nonfiction, biographies, history that had already come into my life. Fiction also, yes, but primarily a lot of nonfiction. It took a life of its own. And at 19, I started writing my first book. It got published at 25, so it took 6 years to finish that project. But yeah, since then, there's been no looking back. But I also want to pose this question to you because you grew up in very interesting settings in small towns as part of an armyman's daughter, which means I imagine books would have kept you company as well.
Yeah, a whole different era. Like screens were science fiction at the time that I was growing up. And I lived in a series of very small towns in North India where the only access to books was always something called English Book Depot. And it was always run by some Joshi uncle, but who was very obliging because he would order the books that were on the left side of the title page of the book that you were reading. Of course, it was very confined in those days to, the standard Enid Blyton and Nancy Drew and so on. But two very interesting things happened in my earliest days of reading. One is that until I started reading, I only spoke our native language, which is a language without a script. So obviously no books. So I'm guessing, I was probably too young to know the process, but I'm guessing that my brain was rewired into English at some point where I was reading only in English. And then another interesting thing took place in my life, which is I discovered writing. But for some reason, 6 and 7-year-old me, who was living in a town where the loo blew for 2 months in a year, it was 40 degrees centigrade, and the dust would get out from, under doors. They would come in, the dust would come inside, and swarms of locusts were destroying our garden on a regular basis. Swarms of locusts that darkened the sky. But I was writing essays with babbling brooks, light summer rain, and rhubarb crumble by the fireplace. So I really didn't see myself in any of those books. It was only later that, sort of well-meaning aunts started sending us these National Book Trust, marvelously written National Book Trust, written by Indian authors, illustrated by Indian artists of a very high level. I mean, we're talking of Badri Narayan and Pulak Biswas. And then the geopolitical sort of world affected our reading when Progress publishers came to India. And the market was flooded with these most wonderful Russian books, beautifully produced, fabulously illustrated, very intriguing stories, all Russian, of course, and available very cheaply, enough for a 10-year-old's pocket money. So that was my, childhood experience of reading.
But I relate to what you're saying because I remember even in school when we did essays for our English papers and stuff, we'd use words like marmalade and scones, and these were not things that were everyday to us,
Yes,
right?
yes.
The only person who I've actually seen having these things on a regular basis is my ex-boss Shashi Tharoor. He has some of these things. I hope this isn't recorded. But, other than that, I think in our everyday life, as you said, it was a very different geography, a very different horizon from a lot of the things we read, especially the Enid Blyton kind of literature.
Yeah.
But that said and done, I'm really glad that I read it because it was for children. There weren't in those days that many options. I remember, we read, as we got a little older, we'd read Archie's comics, Tinkle, Digest. That had a lot of stories.
You were not forbidden comics?
No, not really. I think my parents, we have a joke that they produced us and then they let us grow like fungus on the wall. They didn't really bother very much in terms of policing what we were reading. So both my sister and I managed to get quite advanced very, very rapidly. But, the Tinkle, for example, had a sort of Indian tone and magic. Archie's was very American. I remember thinking, what is a mall? Because in the 90s, there were still no malls around in Pune where I was growing up. That happened after 2000. These things, they opened your world in a certain way. But, I'm quite aware that we did lose out on a lot. And what you said about language also, I do regret the fact that we were never taught to read in my mother tongue, which is Malayalam. We grew up outside Kerala. And I remember on vacations, my grandmother would summon what was called an Ashan. Ashan is like a local village teacher of Malayalam. And he'd come and sort of teach us how to write the alphabet and all of that. And after, you're on holiday, right? You don't want to study when you're on holiday. So after a while, very imperiously, we're like, Ashan, we don't want any lessons from the Ashan, who was duly offended, I think. And that was the end of any Malayalam lessons. I do remember, though, that my mother would sometimes read out to us from this Malayalam comic, I think, called Balarama, which again had a sorceress and a little devil and a Kuttichatan and all of that. So that I remember a little bit from my childhood. But it is a regret even now that a lot of very fine literature that comes out of Kerala, I end up reading that in its English translation rather than the Malayalam original.
The loss of language and
identity because of that. Language is not just language, right?
Yeah,
it's very much rooted
Absolutely.
to identity.
Yeah, in my case, because no script. So unless you know the language and speak it. An interesting fact about Manu, I don't know how many of you know that you all know him as a very eminent historian and a writer, but he's been reclaimed from the world of economics. We have him on our side now. So what was that journey? Did anything inspire you? Were there books that sort of inspired you to change from economics and then international relations and then history? Was it a natural progression?
The reading a lot of history was happening already from my teens. It's just that I don't think I thought of it, and I don't think there were people around to point to the fact that you could build a career out of it. And even now, it's not all that easy for people to do that, right? It's how many people manage to make a living as historians and so on? Not very many. So I don't think that played on anybody's mind that could be an option. So even though I was working on my first book of history from the age of 19 to 25, I never thought that would become my life. That was a secondary project, and then I had to find a job, I had to do other things. And there I always thought I would work in foreign policy and things like that, which is why undergrad was economics and then a diploma in international relations. Master's was international relations at the Department of War Studies, worked with the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Indian Parliament. Even now I attend seminars. I'm part of these leadership programs in this whole foreign relations circuit. And I still attend those conferences and reunions every year. So I've got one toe left in that field, but for most part, I've moved on to history. And I think the conscious choice was after my second book, and I thought, look, might as well make this permanent. So my PhD is history, but you're right, all my earlier graduate degrees, etc., are in other subjects, economics and international relations. But books were always a companion. History books, reading about history was always happening anyway. It's just that enlightenment came to me much later that, wait, this is what I want to do. I don't want to do something where I've got a day job and then I do history on the side. I want to do this full time. Yeah.
That's a hard call to take because history, as you said, it's still not something that you can see very early in life, say as an undergrad, as a career going forward, unless you're going to teach. But you are possibly the earliest, the pioneer in this genre of transcending academia and writing very accessible books for readers. Just, I won't say lay readers, but interested readers. What has that transition been like What inspired it? Was it a particular form of writing that you found? Was it your own voice? Is it something that you read and decided that this is what you wanted to do?
I think, here I'd use that cliched expression, the power of stories, right? Because ultimately, how was my interest even in history born? It was because of stories. We would read school textbooks, which was about 3 sultans, 5 empires, 20 social reforms, the nationalist movement, in this chronological sequence, and you were taught that that was history. And therefore, I don't blame kids for thinking that history is somehow a very dull, boring kind of affair. Whereas every time I went back to my ancestral village in Kerala, history there had a texture, it had a life, it had a flavor. And even small stories, like stories of my own ancestors, I remember, and this is an example I often give, where I remember in school we would read about how widow remarriage was this great reform in India, and how women were, oppressed, and if you lost your husband, that was the end of your life for all practical purposes. You were then treated as a non-entity and had to live in the shadows and the margins. Except I come from a matrilineal community in Kerala where widowhood was not a concept. Divorce was perfectly possible. I had a great-great-grandmother who divorced her first husband, a Brahmin, in the 1870s. Then she took a second husband, my actual great-great-grandfather. He, in turn, had already been married once, had a child from that marriage, left that wife to marry this one. There was already a lot of strange things happening there. So I'm reading something in the textbook, but I'm experiencing something else in my own family. They had 4 kids, and because marriage wasn't such a big deal in the matrilineal system, where brother and sister, that tie was stronger than husband and wife. So my great-grandmother's eldest brother married 4 times. He married a woman first and brought her home. And then the story goes that, this is a big agrarian sort of establishment, right? So the manager comes and he says, "Oh, is that your wife? From a distance, I thought that was your mother standing there." And the story goes that this very feudal great uncle of mine was like, "What? My new bride looks like she's old enough to be my mother? It's very sexist." And he says, "Get rid of her, take her back to her family." And that was that. Then he married a lady, and again someone came and said, "Oh, I think her teeth are a bit prominent." Discarded that wife. The third wife was very fashionable, apparently, she used to curl her hair and very good looking and all of that. But in those days, they used to wear these wooden slippers called mediadis. And inside the house, only the eldest male member would wear that. And one day he's sitting there in the portico and he hears the click-clack sound of these slippers. And he says, "Who's wearing this while I'm in the house?" And it turns out it's his newest wife. And he says, "Well, I really like her a lot. She's very glamorous and beautiful, but she's a bit too overconfident." So got rid of that one also. And then the fourth one he stuck to because she had a lot of property and money, and he spent most of his life, squandering that. So that was the first uncle. The next one was a sister, apparently, again, very good looking and a very talented lady and all of that. Got married to a man, went to his house, discovered that his younger brother was a far more exciting proposition, discarded the first husband, married the younger brother. Third brother thought of himself as a modern man. He said, no, I'm only going to marry once. So he married once, but then he littered the entire village with illegitimate children of all caste groups, no discrimination.
This is history the way I like to hear.
This is history the way it actually happened in my own family. And I was really blessed to have a grandmother who would not censor these things. Most of these stories, a lot of families have, but they would often be covered up and nobody would talk about it. But my grandmother had this very matter-of-factly way of narrating this. I remember going for a walk through the village with her, and she'd say, that house, that's my uncle's, son from such and such a lady. That's my uncle's house from the midwife who came once to take care of his wife. So she would tell these stories, and I was transfixed. I was like, this is, firstly, the matrilineal system in a somewhat more sort of extreme situation. Then there's the whole village life, there's the whole way in which the village life operates. I nearly got cancelled once for telling the story, but in those days there were agrestic laborers, practically slaves. It's very caste-based, and these are Dalit communities that used to work on the fields. They used to actually plow the fields for us. And there was this rule that, firstly, they could not have any good names. So they were named things like Velumbi, Kartagutti, and so on. Velumbi means fair woman, Kartagutti means the dark one. That's how they were named. And they were not allowed to call members of our family by their actual name. They had to say Tambrano Tambrati, my lord or my lady. And there's this story where my grandmother says that one day her mother, my great-grandmother, whose name was Kalyani, she hears her name called out in this very loud way somewhere in the fields. And then she, sends out somebody to find out who's calling her name like that. And it turns out that the same farm laborers who were barred to call our family members by name or anything they named all the farm animals after members of our family. Now you're laughing. I made the mistake of laughing as I narrated the story once and I got cancelled on social media. But the thing is, it's a form of resistance, right? When we think of resistance, we think in history people organizing, there's a morcha, there's some kind of public protest. These are everyday forms of resistance, and that includes humor. That includes using humor to your advantage. Weapons of the weak, as an academic put it once. And I didn't need, therefore, to read Weapons of the Weak as a book to understand it. You see it in village life. You see it in the way people operate. So that's why, to come back to your initial question, for me, therefore, putting history out there as a survey of facts in a sort of sequential way has never been appealing. Because history came to me by absorbing stories, and therefore, for me, those stories matter. And I think we often complain also in today's world of misinformation and social media that, there's so much bad history going around, there's so much WhatsApp history going around. I think historians also have a duty, therefore, not just to complain, but to make the effort to put the stories out there, to make history accessible to people. If I'm only going to publish things for the seminar circuit, then only people in the seminar circuit are going to read it. But if you want to take it out to a larger audience, you need to make the effort to actually woo that larger audience. Nothing's going to come on a silver platter. You have to make the effort for it. And therefore, telling those stories, I think, was always far more interesting as a concept to me than simply studying history as a series of facts and figures and a series of social and economic dynamics. The question ultimately is studying it to what end? For me, it is to put it out in front of a larger audience, and their stories and storytelling and the power of storytelling matters a great deal.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point, and it's something that motivates me or has motivated me to write the non-fiction books that I do, is the fact that there's all this body of information that academics work incredibly hard for. You're an academic, you work. In my case, when I was a student of archaeology, I had these professors who'd done 30 and 40 years of incredible research in Indian archaeology. And all of it was sitting in the library, being read by other academics. None of it was filtering down to the public. And the way I knew this on a personal level was I would meet young people who would say, "Oh, you're an archaeologist, that is so incredible. Have you been to Egypt?" That was the first. And here I'm visualizing the entire library in Deccan College, Pune, filled with treasures of information on Indian archaeology and Indian civilizations. So that is what motivated me to start writing for young people, to make it sort of, I call it stories from stones. It's really stories from the stones that we discover. But having said that, it's incredibly hard, isn't it? The research, your books read so lightly, like we're reading it and we're sort of enjoying ourselves, and at the end of it we say, he's done a fantastic job, I've really understood the Deccan Sultans. But what really goes on behind the scenes?
Yeah, this can sometimes be very mortifying. I remember somebody reading my first book, The Ivory Throne, and telling me, what a wonderful novel. And I said, that's not a novel. But there are dialogues in it. I was like, those are not dialogues, they're quotes from documents.
Yes, exactly.
It's not dialogues, it's just that the story itself is so interesting that it reads in some kind of cinematic way. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't come out of 6 years of archival research with very dusty files and so on. But yes, it is, I think people assume that it's very easy to make history accessible, that somehow it's less challenging and demanding, and that if you don't use a certain kind of jargon and a certain kind of academic language, somehow the work is lighter. That's, I think, a misconception. So actually, in my experience, I've done my PhD dissertation. That came far easily to me because I knew that the readers are who? My examiners, my supervisor, and people who understand these concepts already. So I don't need to explain anything. But when I'm writing for a regular audience, I have to contextualize, I have to make it interesting. Each paragraph has to be worded in a way so that the reader has an incentive to keep turning the pages. I can't take the reader for granted, right? I mean, the thing I dread the most is someone saying, your book was boring. That would really kill it. When your whole appetite is to put out history for people to enjoy and understand and absorb knowledge while also being entertained, by also being interested in what they're reading, you can't really take them for granted. So you have to put in the effort to make it engaging. If it was so easy to make history engaging, everyone would be doing it, right? That's So I would flip the argument where people say that somehow, making history accessible is a bad thing, or it somehow lowers your credibility or whatever. I disagree quite vehemently with that. And it wasn't difficult for me to get a PhD when I did, because frankly, I'd published so many books by then, it was very easy for me to formulate my argument, understand how to use the archives and so on. So that wasn't tough at all. So for me, the journey has in some ways been in the reverse. And I even now see myself more as a storyteller than as somebody who's purely going to sort of regurgitate a bunch of facts and figures in a way that is unattractive. I don't think, especially in our country where we have so much rich history, we've got so many stories to tell, we've just scratched the surface, right? Barely. There's just so much to discover even now. And we are a country of storytellers. That's the greatest tragedy, right? In this great obsession with a Western format of academic writing, which I understand though, people are invested in it because that's how that system operates, and that system has been designed a certain way. But in a country where culturally we are a country of storytellers, it is a tragedy to not invest in storytelling. We are also a culture of orality for that reason, because historically, because of our climate, etc., records were very tough to preserve here. Kerala alone, you wrote everything down on palm leaf manuscripts, they barely survive. A few centuries later, they're already disintegrating. It's very tough to keep written records alive. At the same time, you can't have hardcore history narrated orally. So you encapsulate that in stories, you make it interesting, and that's how it orally passes down the generations. That's why we have so much oral history in our country. Go to any caste community, go to any group, go to any community, in general religious community, everybody has oral accounts of their past. You go to a temple, it'll have its Talapurana in an oral format and so on. So in a culture of storytelling, I think instead of devaluing the idea of storytelling, we should actually embrace it and perhaps set new templates and new formats and new ways of telling history, rather than somehow seeing it as, something to be kept at a distance.
Yeah, because you're also trying to attract a new audience of people who learned history in a very different way and are not at all enamored of it. So you're kind of converting people who've not enjoyed their history very much. I was very inspired by E.H. Gombrich's book, A Little History of the World. Not because I want to write like E.H. Gombrich, because he's got a very Eurocentric view of how he thinks of world history, but because of the enormous amount of information that he's condensed into that beautiful little book, which reads like your books, very easily, and you think, oh, it's sitting so lightly on his shoulders. And that kind of taught me that, it is really hard work. It is huge amounts of information, and you have to really take your audience along for the ride, rather than be talking to them or at them. In my case, a young audience. I feel that every reader who reads my book, particularly a younger person, needs to feel that they're on an exciting ride of some sort. So, would you? Is there any one obligation you feel that you have to your readers? Like, I feel obliged to take them along for a ride.
Yeah, I feel obliged not to bore my readers because, yes. Again,
they're
as
not
I said,
bored at all, Manu.
So far. Yeah. But, you never know when you slip up, right? Especially the more serious your concepts get, the more serious the themes get. The next book that I'm publishing is, in some ways, my most serious book.
Please tell us a bit about this. Is
probably not
insider information, everyone.
It'll be announced on Wednesday next week, so you don't have to wait too long. But it is in many ways a very serious topic. It's something that in some ways is very politicized in our country. So I'm very aware that this in some ways is the heaviest kind of material I'm dealing with. And that was the challenge, right? Like the book is, I think, just over 600 pages. 350 odd pages is the actual text. The rest of it is notes. Because I felt so determined that everything has to be contextualized, every nuance has to be packed in. You can't always do that in the main text, because then you're oversaddling the reader with far too much. Then they won't be able to process it. So my formula is then, dump it in the notes. So those who are interested can go find it in the notes, but I don't at the same time make the main text so overwhelming that people won't understand what I'm saying. But even there, my challenge in the final rounds of the edits was always, oh my God, is this paragraph boring? Is this section boring? If I think that if it's boring, what will the reader think? And that's how you keep editing and revising and improving it, because you can't, as the writer, if you're getting bored with their own paragraph, then you can't inflict it on the reader. I wouldn't do that. So I think for me, the obligation is that you must always treat the reader also with a certain respect, because they're paying hard-earned money to pick up your books. in today's world, books have also become very expensive. I had a fight with my editors at Penguin saying, can you please reduce the price of this book? $9.99 is far too much in the Indian market. I know this from the last time my book was published at 8.99 rupees. And I knew my existing readers would buy it. People of a certain age will buy it because they have the resources. I would keep getting emails and messages from students, 20-year-old, 19-year-old students saying that we don't have the pocket money that allows us to go out and buy an 8.99 rupee book. And this one's going to be 9.99 rupees. I did my best to try and reduce it, made sure there were no color images in it, so those glossy pages don't need to be added, insisted that the notes section, the font be reduced to such a size that the total page length of the book would reduce. Even then, they could only put it out for 999 rupees. So when people are spending that kind of money to actually pick up your book, I think there's a certain amount of respect you owe them. And that's why I say, when I say that you can't bore your reader, the idea is exactly this, that I can't make you spend your money on my book and then bore the life out of you. That doesn't make sense. You have to be part of the journey. You have to feel like you're part of the narrative, that you're enjoying it and learning something. And when you close the book, it should be with a degree of fulfillment rather than a sense of what on earth did I just read.
Absolutely. A really important point, because the next issue of discussion would be science fiction has finally caught up with me, because I am competing for my young readers' attention with screens. So books versus social media. Who has the staying power? What is your
I
view
don't
on
think
that?
these are battles that are, there's a definite sort of thing to it. Some of this is cyclical. At this time, social media is still fresh and new, and people are obsessed with it. People are still investing a lot in it. New things are coming up and so on. But I don't think this is going to be the eternity of life, right? People also go back sometimes to earlier habits. People thought, for example, when ebooks came in, that would be the end of traditional publishing. Actually, no. In India, ebooks sell far less than actual physical copies, because people still enjoy the experience of having a book in the hand rather than reading out of the screen. Because they're seeing so much on a screen anyway, that when they want a book, they want to read a physical book. So I think there are ways in which these things can be reconciled. I don't think a lot of it happens in schools and academic settings. You create space for kids to enjoy their screens. Don't vilify screens beyond a certain point. At the same time, you create a healthy balance where they have enough mind space to cut off from screens and do other things in life. I think one of the great benefits that my generation still had was that we had so much time to just, if I set my house on fire, it was because I had the time to fool around and experiment with fire and do things.
Did you set your house on fire as a matter of interest?
Yes, my father was a professor, and he had a pile of answer sheets of his students or something sitting on a corner. And I was conducting my usual experiments with fire, with some cotton, this, that. And then I think there was a breeze or something, and a nice flaming piece of cotton just flew into the pile of answer sheets and set the whole thing on fire. And there's nobody at home. Luckily, my sister she's 4 years older, so she had the presence of mind to put it out with a blanket or something. But yeah, I wouldn't have known what to do if she wasn't around. Then my mother finally gave me a piece of wood, and she said, you burn this as much as you want, just get over this fire obsession. And it worked, because by the time I got to the bottom of that piece of wood, it was a chunky piece, I was done. I was over with my fire experiments and obsession with fire. So that worked out. But I did set my house on fire. Okay. But the reason I did it is because I had the time and space to do things like that. Yeah. Not that I'm encouraging that, but I had things that I had to do. Yeah. Just fool around, just observe the world around you, go play in the mud. Every time we went to Kerala, the first thing we did was, as city kids, we'd never seen fields, right? We'd see it only once a year when we went on vacation. Yeah. And my father would get all of us in shots, and we'd just walk into the muck. Just walk into the muck, and just, we'd be knee deep in the fields, in that sort of clay and the earth and all of that, and just enjoy that. And, I think all of those experiences also contribute to making an interesting mind, as opposed to, I think are much more circumscribed lives today. So I think kids, if there's a healthy balance between the screen and all of that, or what that represents, and then books and what that represents, I think both can coexist. I don't think it's one versus the other in some eternal fight. They can both be balanced.
Yeah, I agree. But much of what you've been describing is, I feel there's a strong human urge for the tactile. You want to walk in the mud, you want to set things on fire, you want to touch and feel, and so the book is that tactile sort of an emotional response you have. And I was reading somewhere that Douglas Adams told the wonderful Neil Gaiman that books are like sharks, because sharks have existed in the oceans from the time of the dinosaurs. And dinosaurs are extinct, but sharks still exist because sharks are the best at being sharks. So books will, to my mind, exist because books are the best at being books. You know, they will continue forever. So, I mean,
I think
yeah.
you know, I think one way to put it is that so long as in our country political activists and political groups are still burning books, that means books have value. Because if it
we
had no
need to
value, why would they
burn
burn it?
burning again. Yeah. There's a lot of subversive stuff going on up here. We have, I think, about 5 minutes left. So, do we have time for a question? Yeah. Yes.
It feels like you grew up on Western books, and now you write cool books about India and stories. So, was that an antibiotic reaction? Did it tell you what to write about or what not to write about? I mean, or did it help your later thing?
I think that's a good question. I think reading interesting books on, say, Western history, Napoleon, what was happening in Europe, Russia, the Romanovs, and all of that. And I would think, why don't we have books like this about Indian topics, about Indian themes, about Indian subjects? And that's why I ventured into that, which was to marry that style of writing. I write in English, so it has to be that style of writing, which is very much a Western style, but to Indian themes and subjects. At some point, this might go out of fashion. We might come to a stage where we do this in Indian languages, a great thing. So books of mine might, no longer be seen as particularly valuable. But I think that's why the initial trigger came from there, which is that I want to read books like this, of this quality and standing, but on Indian subjects and Indian history. And I think we're slowly building that up now. Now there's more and more people doing that kind of work. And I think more and more stories will therefore come ahead in times to go. Yeah.
About the Western, I was telling you about the babbling brooks and the rhubarb crumble. I think it would have had more of an impact if I wrote fiction. I'm sure that reading would have informed my fiction. But because nonfiction was driven by my desire to put across all this valuable academic information to young people, I found a voice of being like the friendly aunt taking her nephew along on an archaeological dig, which I don't think was particularly influenced by anything that I'd read in Western nonfiction. It was just a voice that I found.
Hi. So this is not a flippant question. I just wanted to check if either of you are looking to write books specific to the texts that children read as part of history lessons.
I didn't understand that exactly. Could you read this?
So,
Are we looking to write textbooks?
Textbooks have their own way, but like the subjects that the textbooks address, are you planning, it would be very good to make that accessible to students so that it's understood. Are you ever planning to write something like that?
Having a conversation earlier about whether I should do children's books. So I think this in some ways is linked to that. It's an interesting proposition. I think it's an interesting challenge also because I haven't done something like that so far. So it would be quite exciting to see if this kind of what we consider serious history on serious topics for adults can actually be explained to kids in a way that they would also enjoy it and savor it, but at the same time understand the complexity. You make it simple but not simplistic, something like that. So it's an interesting challenge. I haven't thought very much about it, but yeah, now you've offered us some food for thought.
I'm not sure that I would, there are so many different curriculums and different textbooks. Some textbooks are quite marvelous. Like the older versions of the NCRT books were really good. So I wouldn't be able to add anything to that. But what I do is that I do a lot of school sessions where we talk about it from a different angle. Like my main interest is material remains and the questioning of any assumption in history. So I would present to them what they're already doing and say, look, how do you know this? They say, oh, well, the Indus Valley, they had all these traders and they had streets and they had seals and they had writing. And my question would be, so how do you know this? So it's really to make them think about what they're learning rather than trying to add or enhance their curriculum in any way. I'd like every child really to think like a historian.
Yeah, hi. This is for
Can't
both
see you. Where are you?
here.
Oh.
Yeah. Just curious about your reading routines now as writers. How much of it is to do with your work? How much of it is, just for yourselves and the blurred boundaries? If you could tell us a little more about that.
This was a discussion we had, but we didn't get a chance to touch on it. My reading life has changed completely since I started writing non-fiction books. Fortunately, unfortunately, much of it is non-fiction because it's associated with work, research, and so on. So once in a while, almost like a guilty pleasure, I will read some fiction. But usually that fiction has some sort of a historical bent to it. I don't know, Manu, you would...
I think I'm very good at compartmentalizing. So my bedtime reading is also always books I want to read. So that'll be fiction. Even if it's non-fiction, it's something I am keen on reading for my own sort of enrichment, fun, just to enjoy the process. But my daytime reading, which is a lot of research for my own writing, etc., that's what I call work reading. So that's a completely different thing. But I managed to sort of balance both. I enjoy taking flights for the simple reason that your phone is off, so you can get through especially fiction, even if it's like really good fiction. I'm a fast reader because the habit's been built up over years, so I can finish half a book one way and then the other half the other way, and that's really fun. So I've managed to sort of find my routine with books, and it's not tough therefore even now. Yeah.
This is a question for Manu. So you were telling all those stories your grandmother told you, very interesting ones. So there is this story where you spoke about the people working in the fields calling their animals Kalyani and the names of the people living in the house. What happened after that? Any repercussions? I hope they were not treated badly.
No. As far as I know, it was considered. See, this was the sacred cow, and these animals were treated very well. In fact, better than the poor Dalits who actually worked over there. That's the fact of the matter. The animals were decorated, and bells would be hung on them, and they were seen as these very precious objects. Because in an agrarian village life, animals matter. That's how you plow your field. And therefore, the animals being named after members of the family was considered okay because they were, distinguished enough creatures to enjoy that privilege. That itself is a commentary, right? That you would prize the animals over the people who actually worked your fields and worked with the animals on the field. Because they were considered impure, but the animals were never considered impure. The Dalits could not approach the house, but the animals used to be brought back to the cowshed and to that general area every evening once the work was done. So that's just, I think they accepted the explanation that animals could be given grand Sanskrit names, but not the Dalits.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, so I just wanted to know what the prep process is kind of like for both of you. So, I think this is very intensive material. So is it just about consuming content? Is it about mostly research? Do you go through different types of media? Is it also about maybe visiting the site that you're talking about, involving yourself in the setting, imbibing your surroundings, so you kind of have maybe some first-hand experiences to go off of? And of course with history, you can't really have first-hand because you're in the present day, so you don't have anything to compare it to. But I think just to get an understanding of what the creative process is like, or the prep to writing, yeah, that's my question.
Well, I do tend to go to the places I'm writing about, as many as possible. You can't go to every place, but a good number of them you can actually visit and see. And that really helps because you get a sense of the lie of the land, the geography. Geography matters a lot to history. Sometimes cultures evolve around the geography of the place. Religious practices evolve because of the geography of the place. So seeing that really helps explain a lot of things. For example, if you're writing about a particular deity in a certain, and that deity has certain characteristics, and then you go to the place, you understand, oh yes, this is a hilly place that used to be a forest, very tough to get to, and therefore that explains a lot of the reasons why the deity is in the form that the deity has. So you're able to sort of connect the dots better if you're actually there personally to see it. I know other historians who've actually visited the battlefields where great battles have occurred and seen what it looks like, and that I think has helped them in their process as well. A lot of the material we use now, in addition to archival written sources, is a lot of oral history, because you often get the counter narrative from marginalized groups, from marginalized voices in those oral narratives. So, the example I would give is of this Kerala king called Martanda Varma. There's the official royal narrative in the Bala Martanda Vijaya Sanskrit play, which explains his narrative from that perch. But you also have in Kanyakumari district a Villupata, which is a local kind of song, which gives you a sort of subaltern view of people on the ground and what they thought about him. Then there's the material evidence. What are the palaces and temples, etc., that this guy has built? What is the style of architecture he's chosen? Where did he get the people from? What does that tell us about the ambitions he had in mind? He's not built his temple in the local Kerala style. He's instead borrowed from the Chola Tamil style of construction. Was he making some kind of statement of his own grandeur as a king, that he's borrowing that imperial Tamil style as opposed to a local modest Kerala style? So you're sort of able to ask those questions based on looking at some of the material evidence. Increasingly, you look at a lot of art. I love, how we talk about the British and Hyder Ali and Tipu Sultan and their conflict and all of that. And there's a sensational poster that the French, I think, made, which shows, I think it's Tipu or Hyder. No, sorry. It's a poster showing an English soldier with his pants pulled down, getting a spank on the bottom from Hyder Ali. And it's a fun little, obviously pejorative, piece of art, but it tells you a lot about the kind of things that were happening at that time, the propaganda that was being put out. You go to Srirangapatna, to Tipu's summer palace there, and there's this huge mural painting over there showing his victory at the Battle of Pulalur. And if you look at the two protagonists, Tipu shown on this oversized horse, smelling a rose in the middle of all this carnage of chopped hands and chopped heads, because he's winning the battle. So it's supposed to present his very, confident sort of demeanor and posture. And then his English opponent, a colonel, is shown sitting in a palanquin chewing his nails. And the palanquin is supposed to represent effeminacy, which is that you're not man enough to meet me. And the chewing of the nails is obvious as well, a mark of no confidence, because they're losing the battle. So you get a window into suddenly Tipu, who's just these records. There's something that you see about his own mind in this piece of art, right? And in this painting on the wall of his palace. So I think you can understand a lot through diverse sources like that. And because, as you said, we weren't there ourselves, it is by putting together as many pieces of the puzzle that we're able to form some reasonable impression of what the past was like. And those pieces can't be just one format. You have to look in different kinds of sources of different types in order to understand what the past may have been like.
I have a great concentration on material remains because I come from a background. And one of the things that really fascinates me about archaeology is the democracy of it. You can't willfully discover a king or a courtier you're really discovering the remains of ordinary people. And then you put together their lives. And you're talking about, cowherds and sort of minor functionaries of a court or somebody very brave who did sometimes you're even talking about pet dogs and cats. So you sort of discover this overall picture of what people were, but you're reading the material remains. But yes, to answer the first part of your question, it is a great deal, I would say a great responsibility to do the kind of research. Much of the writing is research. The writing, once you've done that amount of research, the writing, I think, flows fairly easily because it's the research and the information is there and it's sort of rattling around in your head. And then a story will emerge out of that, which you think a young person would resonate with, and then you just put it down. I'm not sure if that's the process for, yeah.
In all the history research that you've done, and given where we are at this point in time, do you think that we are any different from our ancestors?
No. Human beings, you can always count on our stupidity. We keep making the same mistakes again and again. We reach great highs, then we have great falls. It's just the pattern. All empires rise, they fall. Social trends come, they go. We think that somehow, and look at every generation, like the angst of every generation. Fiction is a great source of history here. You look at poetry, everybody's falling in love, everybody's depressed in love. Happens throughout history, whether it's the 2,000-year-old Sanskrit poetry or English poetry out of England in the Victorian period. People have the same impulses. Politically, where is that? I forget where I read it, but apparently there's something they found in one of these Roman ruins from 2,000 years ago, which talks about how this generation of kids, they're all horrible, they don't listen to their parents and things like that. And you can hear your parents, you would know. So you hear that from your parents even now, right? And the angst, what you said at this point in time, this feeling of this point in time somehow being a very critical point in time, every generation's felt it. Every generation's thought that, oh my God, the country is changing in front of our eyes and so on, and how are we ever going to go back from this? I think we need to sort of take a deep breath, be a little more sort of moderate and calm about a lot of these things, because this is the way of the world. We can't wish it away. Human society is always flawed. Human society is always imperfect. A lot of bad impulses come to the fore sometimes, but equally there are times when that gets reversed. So we might be living through a time that we see as a negative period, but there will be a positive period to follow. There will be another negative period to follow, maybe in our grandchildren's time. There's no way to create an eternal sort of, time of peace and prosperity. That only exists in novels. Yeah, but in all times. So I think, we need to be a bit more sober in, at least I am. I think this is the side effect of reading too much history, which is that nothing really sways you too much. Like on social media, it feels like we are fighting these great civilizational wars. But if you've read enough history, you realize these things are it's like a pattern. It keeps happening and recurring. There's nothing about today that makes it unusually special. Yes, it's a different time with new technology, with new languages. That kind of detail varies. But because human beings throughout history tend to behave in similar ways, our humanity gives us certain impulses. At a core, therefore, those patterns still have a lot in common. So I think reading history gives me a sense of sobriety about the present as well, which is that I don't think it's the end of our days, and I don't think it's a time of doom and things like that, because everything will get its own corrective in due course. I think we do learn, but I think the learning doesn't last long enough. We keep making the same mistakes again, the same patterns of error also recur. And they recur in different formats. So all empires, you take the Bahmani Empire in the Deccan, you take the Vijayanagara Empire, we like to think that it was the barbarians at the frontiers who came and destroyed, but usually it's crumbling from within. It is rot from within that leads to the collapse of these empires, and it's sort of centrifugal forces from within who sort of cause disintegration. It's not so much the enemy on the outside. Ideally, that would mean that throughout history we should learn to, sort of not make these errors, but we never do. And ultimately we will repeat, I think, these errors again and again.
The First World War was called the war to end all wars, the Great War to end all wars, and look where we are now on the planet. Sorry, you said something?
Then why read history?
I think for perspective, this very perspective, that you see the perspective of humanity. Whereas when you're reading current, you think this is the end. We've never done this before. This is new. This is irksome. This is threatening. But really, we've had enough time on the planet for us to say, okay, not this too shall pass, but we will deal with it in a different way. But intrinsically, as humans, I think you have those qualities. Why would you not end wars with the great wars?
I mean, for me, it gives me a sense of optimism always, because I never think that the dark tunnel is going to indefinitely continue, because I've seen that everything, even the dark tunnel has an ending ultimately. So even if times are bleak or whatever, history is what gives perspective. It gives you perspective and makes you realize that this is not the end. This is not the final position on anything. As secure as the world looks, or as insecure as the world looks, neither of those things are as they seem. And I think that's why learning history is useful, because in some ways it can give you a sense of, it can anchor you as an individual also. Like in this world of constant social media squabbling and all of that, if I'm not swayed too much, it's partly because you're able to have that long-term perspective. You're able to sort of zoom out and look at not just the piece of the puzzle, but the full canvas. And that gives you a sense of optimism in my case. I'm not a fatalist when it comes to history either. I see these patterns recurring, but the patterns have good and bad. They have interesting things happening, great things being discovered, great new inventions. All of those things are happening as well. And they're happening often simultaneously, So it's an interesting question. But for me, it reinforces a sense of optimism about life itself. I don't think of everything as some kind of depressing, horrible time where everything is going to the dogs. No.
Thank you very much, Mr. Manu and Ms.
You seem
Devika.
very relieved that we're off stage.
No. It was a very engaging session. And it's amazing to hear how childhood reading still plays such a big role in shaping our adult lives.
Yeah, I know how I loved how both Mr. Manu and Miss Devika share their personal stories. It just goes to show whether you're a historian or a children's book author. Books are lifelong companions.
A big, 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 big thank you to both of them for sharing their journeys with us.